Gamers have always loved a challenge, and more or less since the dawn of the medium, players have been finding ways to make things more difficult for themselves by imposing ridiculous time limits or other restrictions and then gloating because they were able to complete Super Mario 64 with Donkey Kong bongos. Then, in 2009, something happened that kickstarted a change in the games industry. FromSoftware released Demon's Souls, the PS3 exclusive that introduced the world to the concept of getting good. Demon's Souls was well received by critics and audiences alike, but it didn't exactly set the world of gaming ablaze, not immediately in any case. What it did do, however, was pave the way for a game that would not only take the world by storm, but would spawn sequels, imitators, and even a genre of its own, Dark Souls.
Released in 2011, the first Dark Souls placed the player character in an unforgiving world and tasked them with exploring, piecing together the story from scattered bits of lore found by talking to NPCs and finding items, and, of course, fighting incredibly tough enemies.
Since then, the world has been gripped by Souls fever, and each of FromSoftware's releases have been anticipated by fans with bated breath and girded loins. But how did this happen? How on earth did FromSoftware so dramatically change the gaming landscape? Why did Dark Souls resonate so well with audiences? Is Souls fever here to stay, or just another passing fancy? And will our writer ever make it past Ornstein and Smo?
That last question isn't rhetorical, by the way. She's been at it for weeks. Someone should probably check on her. Anyway, I'm Ben from TripleJump, and this is the true story of the rise of Dark Souls.
It may come as a shock to you, but there was a time before Dark Souls dominated the dark fantasy RPG scene. The genre was huge in the 80s and 90s, with titles such as the Wizardry series selling in their millions and heavily influencing the likes of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, or Dragon Warrior, if you want to get North American localization about this. Another series inspired by the likes of the Wizardry franchise was FromSoftware's Kingsfield series, which spawned 4 mainline games between 1994 and 2001. The first Kingsfield title garnered mixed reviews from critics due to its difficulty. However, thanks to good old word of mouth, it was a commercial success, and 3 sequels followed. Sadly, the most recent release, 2001's Kingsfield 4, got a fairly tepid response from critics and fans alike, and the series hasn't really been heard from since. As time marched onward, the dark fantasy genre fell out of favour, and gamers became more interested in first-person shooters like the titles in the Call of Duty and Halo series, which dominated game stores in the mid to late 2000s.
Not everyone was impressed with simplistic combat and fancy set pieces though, and some longed for the glory days of the dark, gloomy, challenge-filled RPG. Luckily, there were those in the industry that wanted the exact same thing.
In the mid-2000s, it felt like many games were more than willing to hold players' hands and reward them for very little effort, and whilst many fantastic titles were released throughout the decade, these weren't to everyone's tastes. One such fellow who really missed ye olde RPGs was the late Takeshi Kajii, then a producer at Sony Computer Entertainment Japan.
A huge fan of the fantasy genre, Kajii was the one who first approached FromSoftware with the idea to revive what he called a lost breed of action game, and the studio got to work on a title that would eventually become Demon's Souls.
Sadly, the project ran into problems almost immediately. A lack of coherent vision from the team meant that they were unable to create a compelling prototype, and the game seemed as though it was doomed before it had even gotten out of the gate. Thankfully, a then little-known coder named Hidetaka Miyazaki heard about the project and got himself assigned to the game. In his words, "When I heard it was a fantasy action role-playing game, I was excited. I figured if I could find a way to take control of the game, I could turn it into anything I wanted. Best of all, if my ideas failed, nobody would care. It was already a failure." I suppose you can't disappoint anyone if their expectations are already non-existent. Miyazaki jumped aboard the project with enthusiasm, however, and changed more or less everything about it, and within 3 years, Demon's Souls was ready to be shared with the world, and the response from gamers was, well, this isn't really what we wanted.
The game debuted at the Tokyo Game Show a few months before its initial release, and it's fair to say that players weren't instantly taken by it. In fact, many didn't even get past the character creator before giving up, and those who did make it as far as the actual gameplay assumed that it was unfinished owing to its punishing difficulty, weird NPCs, and intentional narrative ambiguity.
Unfinished it was not though, and Demon's Souls released in Japan in February 2009 to an underwhelming response from audiences. According to Kajii, in its first week on shelves, the PS3 exclusive sold only 20,000 copies, far fewer than publisher Sony had hoped for. For many games, such an underwhelming commercial performance would be a death knell, but not for Demon's Souls. Those who did play the game and were able to wrap their heads around the mindset needed to beat it fell in love and started spreading the good word of Demon's Souls to their friends. Within a few months, the game surpassed the 100,000 sales mark, and publishers in the West took note. By mid-2010, Demon's Souls had gone global, with Atlas taking it to the States and Bandai Namco publishing the game in the PAL region, but still, not everyone got it. Many critics rated the game highly, praising its atmosphere, world building, and gameplay, but some were dubious of the level of challenge presented and didn't like some of the gameplay features, such as the minimal checkpoints and the lack of ability to pause the game.
It took time for the world to come around to FromSoftware's way of thinking, but Demon's Souls was the spark that ignited the flames of revolution. Players realized that they no longer had to settle for overly simplistic video games, and after finishing with Demon's Souls, they were hungry for more. Despite Miyazaki's lack of faith in himself, Demon's Souls eventually wound up being something of a hit, and naturally players were excited to find out what else FromSoftware had up their sleeves. The answer: Dark Souls.
The gaming world's appetite for challenge had been proven, and as such, Miyazaki and his team had the freedom to create a game that was truly punishing without the fear that audiences would be put off. As the man himself said, "We're trying to create a game that is spicy, and we want to make it as spicy as possible but still edible, and also to make it taste good so that it leaves you wanting more." Although its moniker may imply otherwise, Dark Souls is not a direct sequel to Demon's Souls, and whilst it shares a great deal of DNA with its predecessor, it has its own unique world, characters, and lore. Dark Souls takes place in Lordran and follows a cursed protagonist who embarks on a pilgrimage to prolong the Age of Fire or usher in the Age of Dark. The combat wasn't the only thing that was tricky for players to get their heads around, as unlike the other games of the time, Dark Souls didn't spoon-feed its story to players, and they were instead left to piece the puzzle together from interactions with NPCs, flavor text in item descriptions, and the world's design.
Within just 1 week, Dark Souls had outsold Demon's Souls, and if there was ever any doubt in anyone's mind that punishingly difficult games could be a success, Dark Souls quashed it all. Strangely, it ended up with the same average review score as Demon's Souls, but it outperformed its difficult-to-pronounce predecessor in the commercial department, presumably due to the fact that Demon's Souls had blazed the trail for Dark Souls' success, it was available on multiple platforms rather than being exclusive to one console, and it was much easier to ask for at your local games shop.
This is one of the few times where a game's Japanese title is easier for English speakers to pronounce than its English equivalent. Demonzu Soru is far simpler to say than Demon's Souls, in my opinion. Anyway, I digress. Naturally, where there is success, there are imitators, and it wasn't long before the gaming world saw an influx of games very similar to Demon's Souls and Dark Souls. Souls-likes, if you will. FromSoftware were clearly onto a winner with their Souls games, and before long they were hard at work on more dark fantasy titles that were harder to crack than a diamond walnut.
Following the release of Dark Souls 2 in 2014, something happened to Hidetaka Miyazaki that was completely unprecedented. He was promoted to president of FromSoftware. Within just a decade, he'd gone from coding for the likes of the Armored Core series to running the entire show, which is mind-blowing, though when you consider what his influence did for the developer and the games industry as a whole, it's not surprising that the once directionless auteur went on to become so successful.
Now fully steering the ship, Miyazaki turned his attention to something outside of the Souls sphere, a game that was even more challenging than those that had come before and was nightmare-inducing to boot. Bloodborne. Drawing inspiration from the likes of Bram Stoker's Dracula and H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, Bloodborne immersed players in a gothic world of eldritch horrors made even more tense by its unforgiving combat and ambiguous story, which was, again, left to the player to fathom out.
It was around the time of Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne's release that other developers started to hop aboard the Souls-like train. Perhaps then, now, is a convenient time to take a pause and look at what exactly makes a game a Souls-like. Whilst not everyone agrees on the exact ins and outs, generally, a Souls-like at least possesses the following attributes.
1. A high skill ceiling, which means players may find their characters dying over and over again until they can work out the mechanics of each specific enemy and formulate a strategy to beat them. 2. A sparse number of checkpoints and/or save locations. And finally, 3. Information and lore that is delivered to the player indirectly, usually through things like item descriptions and conversations with NPCs. Lords of the Fallen was one of the first major imitators, aiming to create a slightly more forgiving experience for players and put its own twist on the formula whilst borrowing heavily from the Souls series. Those who are simply incapable of getting good might just find Lords of the Fallen to be a more pleasant experience, although don't go in expecting a cakewalk because this still ain't your grandmother's ARPG. Titan Souls, released in 2015, made no effort to deny its muse, wearing its Souls influence like a badge of honor and even including the word Souls in its title. The top-down action-adventure earned heaps of praise from critics who commended its 16-bit art style, creative boss battles, and emphasis on skill. Since then, a slew of Souls-like games have made it to market, from 2D offerings like Salt and Sanctuary to loose adaptations of Italian literature such as Lies of P. Hell, even Star Wars has gotten in on the Souls-like action, with Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and Star Wars Jedi Survivor undeniably taking inspiration from the combat and checkpoint systems.
With the continued success of these titles, plus the overwhelming reception to Miyazaki's most recent offering, that being 2022's Elden Ring, it would seem that the Souls-like genre is here to stay.
So why exactly has Dark Souls gone down in history as one of the most important video games of all time? Well, as it would happen, there was more than a little bit of luck involved. If Takeshi Koji hadn't longed for a return of the dark fantasy RPGs of decades past, then perhaps no one would have pushed for it, and if it weren't for one coder's interest in a failing project, the world would have never known Demon's Souls.
Luckily, Hidetaka Miyazaki, despite feeling that he lacked ambition, possessed the imagination and creative vision to course-correct a floundering development, and with the support of Sony behind him, he was able to create a game that proved the world was ready for a challenge, paving the way for Dark Souls, its sequels and spiritual successors, and hordes of imitators.
In fact, it would seem that for some, the Souls games simply aren't challenging enough, with a few players finding ways to make the already punishing experiences even harder on themselves. Using everything from Guitar Hero controllers and dance mats to literal bananas to beat the games, there is seemingly no end to the ways Souls players will make life harder for themselves.
In the intro, I asked if the Souls-like craze is just a passing fancy or whether the genre is here to stay. Well, considering that it's been well over a decade since Dark Souls blew the games industry away and Miyazaki's works and the works of those inspired by him continue to garner critical acclaim and commercial success, I'd say that gamers had better get used to the Souls-like genre because it's firmly cemented itself as a core tenet of game design. Oh, and if any of you are wondering whether our writer ever did beat Ornstein and Smo, well, let's just say she's currently out buying polyfiller to fix the hole her controller made in the living room wall. I hope that clears things up for you.